Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, we are continuing the review, and we are going to conclude the review of The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. by Peniel E. Joseph. So, quick recap here. Last week, I touched on the empowerment lineage of Malcolm and Martin. I listed a ton of critical players during the civil rights movement, critical events as well. I explained a few of the turning points in the civil rights movement, and I talked about the political reflection that Malcolm and Martin had, especially towards the end of both of their lives. So now we're going to get into political allies. So when it comes to alliances, I want to emphasize here that although it may seem when you're reading the book that someone has a friend, I assure you it's an alliance. When we're talking about things that need to change and reform, you have to allow yourself to enter into relationships not expecting to be friends, but expecting to get something done or to move closer towards the movement's overall goal. So a lot of the time that can stand on respect, or it can stand on public relations. What can I get out of this? What can this person get out of this? So I just wanted to emphasize that when we're talking about allies and two people that seemingly work together, we're really talking about what they each stand to gain from whatever, situation or the relationship as a whole. Now, in order to talk on this, though, I wanted to point out that this involves lobbying. So we usually only hear about lobbying when it comes to politicians because it means to solicit or try to influence votes of a specific organization or a legislative body. In this case, we're talking about how Malcolm and Martin both lobbied for Black America. Martin more so would disrupt the status quo with civil disobedience, organized civil disobedience, which he used as a political tool when he would craft those different peaceful protesting. So that's kind of like an example of how you can leverage what you have to get what you would like. Now, the first pair I wanted to touch on is Malcolm and core leader James Farmer, who would debate on the college circuit or the university circuit. They would go around to different schools and they would always debate their different ideologies, especially when it came to nonviolent versus by any means necessary. So on stage, they would, state their points, they would debate. Off stage, they were friendly. And that, I think, can be an example of how these two sparring partners that always were going at each other, still all in the name of Black empowerment, but how they can get, more out of a relationship of keeping in touch with someone, of keeping it respectful, than just writing them off completely because they didn't agree on necessarily everything. And this is where it shines that Malcolm X really was, a politician, because a normal person would just say, they think differently than me, I don't need to be involved with them at all. But that's not the case here. And so I wanted to point that out because even though they're both working, towards a better America for Black people, they just disagreed on this one point on how to get it, they still kept in contact. So especially in this day and age of like cancel culture, essentially, where it's like, as soon as I find out something you believe in is something that I don't believe in, then that's done, the relationship is over. You can't write people off necessarily because then you're going to isolate yourself. And I think Malcolm, more than anything, kind of learned towards the end of his life that he can't write everyone off because he's going to end up alone. So that's off track, but that was a great example of keeping it respectful. And they were friendly in this case, but that's not all of these alliances here. Speaking of MLK and JFK. So MLK was quick to call out the White House on anything that he felt they were doing wrong or if they weren't doing enough. But he always in private, he kept a line of communication open on his end because he knew that he still needed to privately lobby for Black America. And so he would, tell the papers, look, I don't think JFK is doing enough. But he would send him a telegram, and he probably would still say, you're not doing enough. But he would say, can we meet to discuss how you can support? What can we do? Let's set up something. And MLK was actually really good at that, because I'm going to touch on his relationship with Lyndon B. Johnson as well. But he always was reaching out to the White House. And that takes a lot, I would think, honestly, even just in the ego department, because he would get ignored a lot. He would be written off a lot by the White House until they needed him, to make them look better, or if they needed him to help them clean up a mess. So, and JFK is an interesting character, because he said in a meeting that is talked about in this book, in reference to one of the horrific events that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, don't be totally harsh on Bull Connor. After all, he has done more for civil rights than anyone else. This is the same Bull Connor that released fire hoses and dogs on peaceful protesters that included children and women. And I'm sure you've seen these pictures in the textbooks, and this resulted in MLK's incarceration and, when he wrote the letters from Birmingham. So let me just read that quote again for you. JFK said to civil rights leaders, don't be totally harsh on Bull Connor. After all, he has done more for civil rights than anyone else. What an asinine quote, but it can't be any more true. This is an example of taking advantage of the bad as well as the good, and making it all count towards the progression of the movement, because that event essentially embarrassed the nation, America, on the world stage. And once you embarrass, a country, now the government is going to come in and be like, okay, how can we make it look like we care? And that's what sparked a turn in JFK and MLK's communication during that time period, because I think in my mind, and this was alluded to it as well, but because this was such the ultimate display of peaceful protesting, and the reaction from the police force was so harsh that, there was no arguing that what happened there was wrong. And so, then the White House was forced to intervene. So that quote, totally out of pocket, for sure. But I mean, that's an example of how you have to strategize your movements when you're trying to win a war, Completely ridiculous. I couldn't believe he said that. I can believe he said that, but that's crazy. And it was alluded that he kind of said it in a joking manner. First of all, what a jackass. But he was right. Now, MLK shared a similar relationship with Bobby Kennedy as he did with JFK. That was mostly just because Bobby Kennedy was kind of like his contact in the White House. So anytime he would communicate with JFK, it was usually started through Bobby Kennedy. So that was another alliance that MLK had. MLK and Lyndon B. Johnson, which came after JFK was assassinated, this relationship was purely public relations on LBJ's part. And that's, because he signed those acts that I mentioned last week, but when it came to Martin Luther King shifting slightly his ideologies and shifting to include economic empowerment, and when he started talking out against the Vietnam War, LBJ noticeably distanced himself from MLK, someone who he was touting around before, this is the guy that's leading those peaceful movements, and he's going about it in such a respectful manner, and blah, blah, blah. But in 1966, when LBJ had organized the Civil Rights Conference, he ensured that MLK didn't shine as much. He ensured that he didn't have an opportunity to give a powerful speech and win over these people. And it was mainly because of his stance on Vietnam. And that's because this is when MLK kind of became a liability for the White House to associate with, because that's when MLK kind of started pissing off a lot of the white liberals. So once that was, starting to happen, he was like, yeah, I'm good. So, you have to look at it as like, once you're no longer useful to someone, then that's it. But MLK, the class act that he still would reach out, through telegrams, through the newspaper. At one point, the only way that he could communicate with the White House was through the press, and he would speak on how they weren't helping enough again. So he still would reach out, even though he knew what they were doing. He knew that they were distancing themselves from him. And it was said in the book that civil rights conference, when he was essentially snubbed, he was really embarrassed by it. But he still continued, to do what he had been doing and keeping those channels of communication open. So that's a great example of political strategy and keeping your alliances in a place where you will always gain something from it. And it's an example of when people think that you're no longer useful, and that's it. Now, Malcolm and Martin also kind of represented Black America to other nations. In 1960, Malcolm met with Fidel Castro, who was, from Cuba, and he had previously overthrown their previous government in 1959. And MLK met with Ahmed Ben Bella in 1962 from the Algerian Republic. And they had earned their independence from France earlier that year in what was described as a major decolonization war. The topic of that meeting was how segregation related to colonialism, which is, a foreshadowing of when MLK would branch out and involved worldly issues under the umbrella of Black empowerment in the late 60s. So these two meetings really solidified MLK and Malcolm as Black political leaders, because you have representatives from other nations, other republics and countries coming over to talk to you, and they want to talk to you. In my opinion, I think that's what really pissed a lot of people off, because they're like, we didn't elect these people, and by people I mean the government. We didn't elect these two to represent America. Why do we have other representatives coming to meet with them? So that just shows the power that they had and the potential for the alliances that they could have made going forward that really, shook a lot of people and made a lot of people scared. And lastly, when it comes to political alliances, I want to talk on the power plays between SNCC, SCLC, and CORE. And I think eventually I need to read a book on these three. There has to be a book like discussing these organizations and how they interacted with each other. But because for them, they represented kind of a similar group where it was like young activist students, things like that. But they had differing, ideas on how to deal with things, much like Malcolm and Martin. And so what they would do, though, is that whoever had the stronger reach in a certain territory, a certain county or state, that's who would kind of lead the cause if there was something going on there, or if there was a protest to be planned there. If there needed to be organizing, whoever had the stronger reach, that's who would kind of head it up. And I think that's an example of how they worked together, whether it be inadvertently for the greater cause, and they didn't resort to infighting and, just isolating themselves off and doing their own thing. A great example of this is the March Against Fire in 1966. And this is a combination of the efforts of SNCC, SCLC, and CORE. I also did not know, because they didn't teach us about the March Against Fear, I did not know Stokely Carmichael and MLK essentially headed that up. They were marching together in a lot of instances. I just never, when I think of Stokely Carmichael, I just solely think Black Panthers. I never think of his involvement with the civil rights movement. I never knew that he had interactions with Malcolm X and interactions with MLK and led a protest with MLK. I just never put two and two together. I always assume that he's a part of the generation after MLK and Malcolm who came up with, the Black Power and whatnot. So, which he did, but yeah, so that was another interesting description when it came to the events that happened during the March Against Fear. It was a weird time period because it was after Malcolm X had been assassinated, and that kind of slot of energy was empty, and Stokely kind of came up. He didn't fill it completely, but he was there to represent that sort of feeling. And then we had MLK, who had been changing up his narrative a little bit. So that was a really interesting year, 1966, because things were starting to look differently than they had before. All right, so let's talk about themes. Dualism is, obviously we're talking the sword and the shield, so we got to touch on this and the symbolism here. So by definition, dualism is consisting of two parts, two mutually irreducible substances, unable to be reduced or simplified. I think that last part of the definition, unable to be reduced or simplified, describes Malcolm and Martin very well, because there was so much more to them than like this peaceful protest versus by any means necessary narrative. But let's talk about those different symbols that they represented. So the sword and the shield can be also described as provoke and protect, offense and defense. Malcolm would be the political agitator, MLK would be the peaceful progress. But then we also have the North and the South and their differing approaches to ending segregation and racism. I never really thought about Malcolm representing the North and Martin representing the South before. I never put that together. But when you look at it, Malcolm spent, his adult years in the North. And I would say when it comes to his representation, he was mainly repping, like Harlem, Chicago, cities like that. But they were dealing with a lot of covert racism. So this is the home of white liberals. This is where a lot of police brutality happens. But, supposedly you have allies. But they want you to act a certain way, look a certain way, and kind of stay in your own lane, also known as respectability politics. So if you've read the autobiography of Malcolm X, he had a perm in his hair before, and he wanted to look a certain way because that's what was expected of Black people in the North. You need to, I don't want to say assimilate, but you can't look like how you naturally look. And that, you could say that there were allies in the North, but there were still segregated neighborhoods and cities, and they didn't want you to be in their space, essentially. Whereas with the South and Martin, they were dealing with overt racism and physical harm. Lynchings is the ultimate example of that. They also had extreme poverty, dirt roads, kids with no clothes, families with no food, but also they're a little more spread out. So it could be harder for a Black family to feel like they have support down there. Whereas in the cities, you're in a neighborhood full of Black people. So it makes sense that they had differing approaches to ending segregation and ending racism and uplifting Black people, because Malcolm was dealing with white people. He knew he interacted with white people in a different way than in the South. And so for him, that's why he would often talk about how a lot of the things that Martin was involved in was performative, because for him, he had seen it all before and the results were still the same. They were still segregated. They were still seen as less than. So I never thought about it before, but I did think that made a lot of sense in the scheme of Malcolm and Martin's lives and how they felt about things, because they were raised, differently. So. And lastly, this one, of course, Black and white, race relations, separately equal. That's another example of dualism. Now, when it comes to international influence, Malcolm X and third world oppression, so he would see these different third world powers rising up and driving out the colonizers. And that was really his influence for a good portion of his career. Whereas MLK really held Mahatma Gandhi in a high regard, and how his nonviolent approach led to long-term success. So it took them a while to get what they wanted, but it was worth it in the end. And there's also this illusion when it comes to Malcolm that Black America could have been a third world power. They could have, drove out the colonizers and set up their own, their own everything. And that was a big, also, side note, that's a big, what do I want to say? A big thing with the Nation of Islam, where the idea is to set up your own society, set up your own economy and all this other stuff. But for them, internationally, for Malcolm and Martin, they could see these other things happening, these differing approaches working for other countries, and that was more fuel for them to push what they were pushing. The next theme is political power versus religious leadership. So, of course, Malcolm was a minister, MLK was a pastor. Their religious mentors were the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Daddy King, who is MLK's father. So at first, they weren't interested in facilitating political campaigns. Malcolm was explicitly warned against involving the nation in politics, but I think that freedom was only ever possible through the combined efforts of a religious foundation, of the charisma that they had, and the political strategy that they implemented later on. With religion, it's interesting in the Black community that ministers have and have always had a stronghold on the Black family. So whether it's Christianity or whether it's Islam, whoever's training these ministers, these pastors, will ultimately train a leader that has the capabilities of leading the masses, because they started on this pull in the church. And when you have an audience like that takes everything that you say to heart, that pulls strength from your words, now you have the ability and you have the experience to deal with more than just your church, more than just the people that you're talking to, the 100 people maybe that you're talking to every week. So I think that religious leaders having that foundation and that background and communicating with people on grand stages really does set you up to be a good, I was going to say a good politician, but politicians are a little shady, but it puts you in a position to be able to lead, is basically what I'm saying. And I've noticed as well, when it comes to religion in the church, a lot of our entertainers, like the singers, the musicians, a lot of them started out in church as well. So there has to be something there. There's some power that they're pulling from, to influence a greater amount of people than they normally would. So, there's something to be said for that. And of course, that goes back to slavery, when the only thing that slaves had was the religion that they were taught by their masters to cling to. That was the only thing they could cling to for strength and for motivation. So, okay, last one here is the press. All right, so here's the thing with the press. I said last week that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI should be ashamed of themselves. I think some of the press, some of these newspapers should also be ashamed of themselves, because they ultimately fanned the flames, that between different parties, most notably between the Nation of Islam and Malcolm, they were printing taunting headlines and just really trying to get citizens riled up against, whoever may be. And the irony in that is that Muhammad Speaks, which is a Nation of Islam newspaper, was Malcolm's strongest voice at one point. That's kind of what really introduced him to the world, because it amplified, his thoughts to everyone else. They also fanned the flames between Malcolm and Martin. Now, it's not enough that Malcolm and Martin had differing views, right? They would print certain stuff specifically to, get a rise out of the other. And I'm talking about the press. I'm not necessarily talking about Malcolm and Martin, because one thing I did learn towards the end of this book is that you didn't have to call them friends, but they were amicable at the very least. So, and they didn't really have ill feelings like that towards each other, no matter what they preach, They were stand-up men, basically, is what I'm saying. These were real men, that they weren't about that petty stuff. They just wanted to get done what they needed to get done. Now, an example, the Chicago Defender printed a picture of Malcolm and Martin's meeting where they shook hands actually during this meeting, but they didn't print that picture. They printed a picture of them just, standing there, and they captioned it "a bizarre union." So this failing to show the picture of them shaking hands and then stating that it's a bizarre union, that is fanning the flames, and it's very subtle, but it's missing out on the opportunity to show that these two can be amicable, which I think would have been very beneficial for the people during that time period, because it would have been like, you don't have to choose. You don't have to look at these two and say, oh, well, I'm rocking with this one, so that one's the enemy. You don't have to do that. You can look at the picture of them shaking hands and be like, all right, so they don't think the same, but at least they can get along. That would have done a lot for the people back then if they would have just shown them in a better light during that one meeting. I think maybe they met another time, but that was it. Like, there weren't a lot of pictures of them together. I think that might have been the only meeting that there was a lot of press around, so they took pictures and stuff, and you can actually Google this stuff. Now, what the press should have been doing is just sticking to the basics, just printing the speeches, publishing them to the wide-ranging audiences so that someone in the South could read the speech that Malcolm said in New York that morning. And also continue with the response and reply. So I mentioned before that at a point in time, MLK could only really reach the White House through the press. And so he would state his opinions to the press, and they would go there, and also print the different speeches of Malcolm and Martin, and not print them in a way that they're battling each other. Now, when we talk author intention, of course, I don't know the author. I think he's an excellent person just from reading this book and, all the work that had to have gone into research and references. But I will say that I think that pulling from the beginning of the book, that this is to rescue Malcolm and Martin from the suffocating mythology and derailing the notion that they can only be described as each other's opposites, which is completely unfair to them because they weren't each other's opposites. They were fighting under the same umbrella for the same cause. They just had different views on how to get it. And so to label one good and one bad is really a disservice to the civil rights movement as a whole, because you're not telling the whole story. Joseph said, their ubiquitous presence in American popular and political culture flattens a deeper understanding of their legacies, which is so true. A good example of that is the holidays that we have for MLK. They don't have a holiday for Malcolm X, so that right there is like, it's painting MLK at a higher regard than Malcolm. And the basic history lessons that you get in school, I don't know about y'all, but when I was in elementary school, we were taught that the civil rights movement was headed by Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and maybe a few other people, and that was it. And so they're leaving out a whole chunk of what was actually going on. I didn't know about SNCC and SCLC and CORE until I got to college and I took Black American Studies classes. So you can't just tell the civil rights movement by one person's journey, because there were a lot of people involved in what was happening behind the scenes. And I didn't even mention all of them in the critical players. There were a lot of leaders and people that were supporting this cause by going around organizing. In the South, in the dirty South, there were organizations that may have been short-lived, but that led on to the formation of another organization. I just think that, if you're going to tell it, maybe try to tell like a good chunk of it and not just a little bit. I think he also wants to give us a new interpretation of the sword and the shield. He says at various points, MLK and Malcolm each utilized the political sword and shield. I would take it a step further and say that I think there were times when they both had their own sword and shield. So again, I'm just looking at them as like fighting on the same front. And they each have their own tactics of how to get there, and them working together, even though they didn't really work together, but them doing what they were doing contributed to the success of the civil rights movement. And lastly, when it comes to author intention, I would say, if anything, this book is really about nuance. increasing the ability to understand that, especially towards the end of their lives, there was a lot of nuance in what was going on. You know, it was no longer, okay, by any means necessary, you know, Black power, all this stuff. It was no longer peaceful protest is the only way to go. Their opinions and views shifted. An example of that, and an example of their converging ideologies coming together, you know, closer than they'd ever been, is both of their awareness of socialism and how poverty reform has to be necessary for Black Americans. For Martin, he kind of alluded to the fact that violence, sometimes it has to be used as a necessary defense, whereas with Malcolm, he said towards the end that nonviolence is kind of like, I mean, nonviolence isn't bad, but anything for the cause is positive. So do what you got to do. You know, I'm no longer saying that that's completely irrelevant. Gender, they both kind of had, I wouldn't say it's the most progressive liberal views of women towards the end of their lives, but they kind of had to come around to understanding that women were integral intellectuals, and especially they were very important people in this movement. With political power, I think they both learned that some alliances were necessary, even if you didn't really want to talk to that person. And lastly, Pan-Africanism, the idea that it's bigger than America, you know, is bigger than what we're seeing here. This is happening all over the world. So let's maybe reach across and take notes from that person or that group or that uprising, or try to, you know, get them on our side, you know. So they both came to that conclusion towards the end. When it comes to my review, I can't believe we're already here. Honestly, okay, so this book, when it comes to the verbiage, it's very like academia heavy. And I don't mean like, it's not like a textbook, but there's a lot of information in this book. And for me, I'm the type of person where if I see something or a name or an event that I'm not aware of, I have to stop and like Google it, maybe watch a couple documentaries about it so I can understand the context behind it and, you know, continue to read this book. So for me, it wasn't a quick read. I think I started last year and I just finished. It's not going to take you that long. I just like was stopping and starting. But I do think that it's beneficial to maybe read one chapter and then just think on that, digest that information, and go on to the next chapter. So I don't think you should skim through this book though. You need to catch every little detail and every little gem in there. I liked how chapter 1 and 2 described them separately. And then from then on, it was really just a story in chronological order. And we would get the information from Malcolm and Martin's lives interchangeably, so as they happened. And it was great because it was like he would describe something that Malcolm was doing, and then he would be like, well, during this time, MLK was doing X, Y, and Z. And it really put things into context because I never, you know, for some reason, I just don't think of certain events happening around the same time or, you know, whatever may have you. And of course, until Malcolm did die, well, he was assassinated first. So after that, those chapters were about MLK, and they were mostly about how he changed after Malcolm was assassinated. Chapter 8 is titled Seeking Freedom Like Dr. King But Faster. This chapter is the one that concluded with Malcolm's assassination, and the irony in the title of this chapter is that King would be assassinated years later and he was seeking freedom. And so when you look at it like seeking freedom is, you know, seeking the truth until I get assassinated, that title is true. Seeking freedom like Dr. King but faster, Malcolm did get assassinated faster, so I thought that was clever to name the chapter that. So all in all, is this a reread? Yeah. So I will be rereading this a chapter at a time until I catch every little detail again. There's far more to these two figures than what is taught in grade school. And I think if anything, I was surprised that this is kind of a lesson on political strategy. And I just was not expecting that. And the leadership that they really showed behind the scenes, I think that should be a college course. It should be like a Black American Study course / a political science course in my mind, because there's more to what the amount of work that was going on behind the scenes and the amount of strategizing and alliances. It's just insane. These were two very big figures that I don't think we'll ever see that amount of leadership in my lifetime. So my takeaways here are that many will try to fill these shoes, but this amount of power can be harnessed appropriately by very few. I think that if you want to continue Black history education outside of February, this is a great start. Very good book, very informative. And if I could learn something from it and I thought I knew everything about these two people, then I'm sure anyone can learn. And I want to end with a quote by Martin Luther King. So oftentimes MLK is quoted, and they're the nice, sweet quotes that people like to use. But this one is very necessary. Unfortunately, we still have to repeat this. But MLK once said, "The greatness of America is the right to protest for right." The greatness of America is the right to protest for right. So for the Tennessee Three, the Democratic representatives, including Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, and Gloria Johnson, who were protesting peacefully and were expelled. Well, Gloria Johnson was not expelled. I believe by this point, as of today, I believe Justin and Justin have been reinstated. But we have to understand that America, the foundation of America, is to protest. It is to always seek for a better country. That's how we became a country. If we never protested, if we never complained, we would still be under the rule of the UK. So the ability to protest and to question is American. That's an American right. And we should not be punishing each other for exercising that right. And that's all I'm going to say on that. So, thank you for tuning into another episode. I will see you all next week.